My name is Kamyar Aram. I'm University of California Cooperative Extension Farm Advisor for what I call the Mount Diablo region. I cover Alameda and Contra Costa counties on basically every specialty crop, which is everything except field crops. So it's been nice to work with Julie and Luca and Ken Wong in putting these programs together, and it's nice to be presenting to you today about powdery mildew. So just real first, how many of you were thinking about mildew this morning? Right. You should be. If you're, we've got bud break, which is lovely, so congratulations. Bud break has started. The 2025 season is rolling, and these are the perfect conditions for mildew. It's rained, and the temperatures are mild. They're a little bit on the cool side, so fortunately, there's still time to act. Morning. Come on in. Just real quick, also, just roughly, how well do you think you're familiar with powdery mildew? On a scale of 1 to 10. Just throw.
12.
Yeah. Do you feel like you know a fair amount about its biology? No? Okay. So we're going to talk about the biology this morning. This is powdery mildew of grapevine. Its biology as it relates to management. So let's get started. Most of you probably know mildew at least in this way, right? You've seen it out there. And that's kind of like the worst thing, a winemaker's nightmare, kind of on the right. And therefore a viticulturalist's nightmare too. And often you can see this is essentially a white powdery coating on the leaves that spells trouble. So this is a fungal disease. So it's a fungus. It affects all the green parts of a grapevine. Or you can think of it as all the succulent tissue, not the trunk, not the hardened canes, but everything that's green, which includes the flowers and the fruit. And the big deal is that it can directly damage the clusters. It can inhibit ripening, and it also predisposes the fruit to other diseases. And even just low levels of mildew itself can introduce off flavors and textures into the wine. So there's generally a very low tolerance for it at the winery. But first, let's just do a quick introduction to plant diseases, to plant pathology. And my background actually has been largely in plant pathology. So what is a plant disease? It's a little different than how we think about disease in human or animal context. It's essentially some kind of damage or harm that's caused by a microbe on plants. Generally speaking, we're talking about parasites. So these are microbes that have evolved to be parasitic on plants. And these are mainly fungi, viruses, bacteria, and nematodes. Anything that you can see with the naked eye or even like a hand lens generally is going to be more of like a pest maybe. And the damage they do are generally referred to as injuries or damage. And then we may have some non-biologically caused problems that we usually refer to as disorders. And these are, and then if you have nutrient deficiencies or toxicities, that's how we talk about it. When we talk about disease, we're generally talking about a biotic or living agent that is evolved to be a parasite. And this is the famous disease triangle, which kind of highlights when disease happens. When plant disease happens, is you have a compatible relationship between the parasite or the pathogen and the host. These are kind of define themselves against each other, right? A pathogen is something that can infect a plant and feed on it, and a host is how we refer to the plant that can get infected. But also, the third important element is that the environmental conditions need to be right for that to happen. And so that's a key part. So we want to keep this in mind as we kind of go through and explore powdery mildew as a plant disease. And then the other thing is when a plant disease happens, we identify it by two different things. One are signs, which is you actually see the parasite, the pathogen there. So that powdery cover, that white gray powdery cover, that's actually the mildew itself. But sometimes you might just see a symptom, which is a change in the plant that's caused by the parasite. And that's on the right. You can just see some yellowing. And that's mildew too. It just hasn't gone to the stage where you can actually see the white powder yet. All right, so what is it? Powdery mildew of grapevine is caused by a fungus that has the scientific name Erysife nicator. It can be pronounced a few different ways. Sometimes people say Erysife. I've heard Erysife. That doesn't sound very good. It used to be called Uncinula nicator, and that you may read about it some places. It's called Uncinula. And fungi, when they're first identified, sometimes they don't know the sexual stage, and it gets a name for the asexual form of the fungus. So you may also see Oidium tuckeri. Anyway, mostly when you read about it, you might encounter the name Erysife, Uncinula. Those are things that you should just be able to recognize, but not more important than that. Usually it'll just be called grape powdery mildew. And so powdery mildew is, I think probably many of you have seen. Do you garden? Anybody, any gardeners here? Yeah. Do you see powdery mildew on other things? A lot of different things, right? Roses, squashes. There's almost a powdery mildew for everything. And so there's a whole group, and they're all pretty closely related fungi. And they are all obligate parasites. So what does that mean? Any thoughts? Means that they can only grow on living plant tissue. If you got some dead leaves, it's not growing in that. It might be surviving as resting spores in there, but it's only able to grow and reproduce on living plant tissue. The other thing is that they're generally very specialized, so that each type or each species of powdery mildew can only really grow on a very narrow range of plants. So Erysife nicator can only really grow on grapevines. There's some types of it that might grow on Boston ivy or Virginia creeper, which are very closely related plants, but they're probably not going to those probably won't be very effective on grapes. So when you see grape powdery mildew, it really came from spores and propagules that were reproduction on grapes. And if you see like powdery mildew on your roses, it's not going to get on your grapes. Now there's an old practice of planting roses at the head of grape rows, right? It's because when you see mildew on the rose, you know it's coming on the grapes. And that's not entirely wrong, because the conditions that are conducive to mildew growing on roses are also when it can grow on grapes, but it's not the same fungus. The rose powdery mildew is a separate species, and the grape one is a separate species. The one that grows on squash is separate. Sometimes they cross, they might grow a few type of very closely related plants, but they're not, but they don't jump very broadly. So yeah, when you see that growing on your roses, you see the mildew, it's like, conditions are good, but it's not going to jump to the grapes. So this specific type of powdery mildew of grape originated in the eastern United States and actually spread to California and to Europe around similar time as grapes were transferred from one place to the other. And the big, and now it's everywhere where grapes are grown. Basically, it's in Australia, it's in Europe, South America. And actually, so in Europe, what else was spread in the 1800s that was a pretty big deal? Phylloxera, yeah. So we talk about phylloxera a lot. That really changed grape growing, wine grape growing, because what species are most wine grapes? Almost all of them. They're the European grapevine, right? Vitis vinifera. Those evolved in Europe and Central Asia. They never had met the grape powdery mildew before, like the North American grape species had. And so they never evolved any resistance. They never had to. And as soon as it got transferred over, with phylloxera and powdery mildew, just about wiped out the native grapevines, wild grapevines of Europe. And the reason that the vineyards survive is, well, we started grafting on rootstocks that are protected against phylloxera, and somebody in France discovered Bordeaux mixture, right? And so they could manage mildew, and it's been a fight ever since. So the story is basically you're always going to have to worry about mildew. So long as we're growing Vitis vinifera grapes, which is make the best wine, we're going to be worrying about mildew. There's a lot of stuff in the pipeline, like they're going to edit a single gene and make Chardonnay not resistant to mildew. We'll see if consumers will be okay with that. I'm sure if they are, most of you will probably adopt them. But until we get there, there's other things we got to do. Mostly we got to spray. So, but there is some variability in susceptibility. So from a management point of view, I'm sure many of you know, like Chardonnay, Carignan get it really badly. Zinfandel, not so much. And everything kind of falls in between somewhere. The other thing is actually, North American grapes in the wild, they're largely resistant, but that varies too. So so some of even like a Concord grape actually gets mildew kind of bad sometimes. The other part of it, of course, it's not just the genetics, right? The genetics part of it. What was the other big thing? Environment. Thank you. So we'll move on to talk more about that. This is the life cycle of powdery mildew in an illustration. Don't worry about this so much right now. We'll come back to this. But basically, when we want to use integrated pest management or integrated disease management, it's really important to know the life cycle, because that's really where we're trying to intervene. We want to act when the pest or disease is most vulnerable. So we'll come back to this. It's a little complicated. I think it's better to start with like an annual disease timeline and move along and think about what's happening. And so the key touchstones for the powdery mildew season are some of the key touchstones for grape growing. So it's bud break, flower and fruit set, veraison, and dormancy. So let's get started with right now. So we're coming out of winter dormancy and going into bud break. What's going on? So mildew can survive in the vineyard in two different places in our mild climate here in California, the climate that makes it so good for growing grapes, but the winters are mild. So you actually can have persistence of infections in the buds. So the fungus is growing. As that tissue starts to go into dormancy, it just kind of a little bit of that fungus stays under the bud scale and kind of just waits and survives until until the new shoot growth comes. And I have not really seen this, and I don't know, I don't know, Luca can comment, or any of you can comment. Have you seen what are called flag shoots? I'm not in vineyards as much as I used to be once upon a time. So, but anyway, basically this is a shoot that emerges and is just gets colonized right away because it came out of a bud that had the fungus in it. The other way that the fungus survives the winter, which is how it does it in even very cold climates and everywhere, is in these little survival structures. They're called chasmothecia. You could call them fruiting bodies. So that you can see that down here. Pretty actually cool looking thing. And actually I'm going to show you. So at bud break right now, we got some rain, and these fruiting bodies, these chasmothecia, by the way, we'll talk about that in a second, why it's called chasmothecia, is this. So these are just stuck to the bark. You can see it's got these little arms. And when they get wet, they eject their spores. And then those spores spread around and splash around in the wind and rain. And let's see if I can get... So there it is. It's called a chasmothecium because it cracks like a chasm. And so what you see coming out there are the spores. This is a lovely video somebody put online. They're called ascospores. This is an ascomycete, which means it's just a sac fungus. It's a sac fungus because the spores are in the sac. And actually, it looks like you can see them kind of jumping out of that sac. I think it's out of the screen, but you can see that lower sac kind of getting a little smaller there. It's got these appendages. Those are what helps it cling to the bark or to the leaves. So this is what's happening right now as these survival structures are getting wet out there in the vineyard. And then I was just going to say, yeah, so the pigmentation, you can see it's really dark. That protects it against ultraviolet radiation. The rest of the fungus is very susceptible. And then you see these branched little ends of its arms. And actually, that's where the name uncinula came from. Uncinulate means to have hooks. So that's how they survive the winter. And bud break is where we start to worry about it. There's two reasons. They do start to, when the temperatures go above 50 degrees and you have rain, that's when these guys start releasing spores. But that could happen before we have bud break. And bud break varies for different varieties. So you could put a delayed dormant spray to kind of knock these guys out. In fact, it's probably, if you know you've had a bad season previously with mildew, that's probably a good thing to do. But really, we start worrying about it when we have bud break and shoot growth. The next window that's really critical is now we've got the shoots growing and we're heading towards bloom and fruit set. So flowers and early fruit are highly susceptible. Oh, but first, let's just actually, let's cover the fact that, so once that spore lands on a leaf or a green stem, then it's hard to see from here. I don't know if you can hopefully see it better. Yeah, so that illustration on the left, that bottom, those little blocks are the cells of the plant. They're the epidermal or outer skin layers of the plant. And the spore just punches a little hole in the cell wall and then puts almost like a little fingered hand, and it doesn't break the membrane because that would kill the cell. It just attaches to the soft membrane inside the cell wall and it starts sucking nutrients out of it. And so it's a feeding on a living host tissue. Some pathogens will kill the plant tissue and then just eat the dead stuff, but the powdery mildews, they keep the plant alive, keep the cells alive, and just suck them slowly over time. And then, and then as soon as that little spores got in there and it's fed a little bit, it'll spread more of these filaments, what we call the mycelium of the fungus, spreads across the surface of the leaf and punches into the surrounding cells and starts feeding off of those. And once it's got enough nutrients, it starts to produce these are the asexual spores. So these are like cloning spores. The spores that came out of the fruiting body that overwinters, those were a result of a sexual crossing. But these guys are just like little clones of the fungus. And it produces millions of them, And you could see each part, as soon as it's got enough nutrients, it'll just start putting out these chains of spores. So you can see this is actually a different kind of powdery mildew, but it's basically the same thing. These chains of white spores or clear spores. They're called conidia in mycological terms, but we just can call them asexual spores. And these chains are what gives that powdery appearance to the leaves once the disease is advanced. So if you see that powdery kind of cover, those are spores. It's sporulating. It's reproducing. Spores, now spores are produced as the fungus feeds, but when they get blown off and into a new part of the plant, the conditions that are favorable for them to sprout and grow are basically temperatures between 50 and 80 degrees and high humidity. And the optimal conditions where it's really perfect is between 70 and 85 degrees and 85% humidity. So if you're out in the vineyard and you're feeling pretty comfortable, so is the powdery mildew. And under those optimal conditions, it can reproduce as fast as 5 to 10 days. Like it can go from a spore starting out and then producing new spores. In this way, the disease can be, under the right conditions, really explosive.
We don't really have a very humid climate here.
No, we don't. That's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. We don't have a very humid climate. But how is it in the canopy, where those plants are sucking up water for photosynthesis, and they're transpiring it out? So we'll get to that a little bit more, but the denser your canopy, the less open it is, the more humid it likely will be, just from the transpiration of the plants themselves.
So fog is a disaster.
Fog is a big deal. If the temperatures are between 50 and 80 degrees and it's foggy, that's good weather for mildew. So now, counterwise, when we get into the warmer part of the season, as temperatures go, above 85 and towards 90, the mildew just kind of stops. It can't tolerate growing in that condition. And if it goes above 95 degrees, again, we're talking about in the canopy. So the canopy is transpiring. It's cooler than it is out where you are. But in the canopy, if it gets about 95 degrees, then mildew can actually die. And so it becomes less of a problem as temperatures go up, and also humidity is less of a problem because even though the plants are transpiring, it's just drying off really quickly. So it's those mild periods that are really the key. So yeah, again, remember it's all about the temperature in the canopy, not in the air. And so infections show up as these yellowing spots at first. And then as they get very advanced, when you see the powder, it's pretty far along. So the flowering and fruit set are the critical stage. The reason is they're green. The fruit and the flowers and early fruit are green tissue. They're photosynthesizing. And the fungus basically sees photosynthesizing cells, going to stick its feeders in there and start feeding. Problem is, once it's there, and because the fruits start out so small, it's very easy for that fungus to cover it. And even if you stop further spread, as that fruit grows, it's going to have damage. So that's why I think most of you probably are aware that's when you worry about fungus, about powdery mildew, about mold. So the other interesting thing is, well, first, expanding leaves, younger leaves are more susceptible too. As the leaves get mature, they become less susceptible, but they remain susceptible throughout the whole season. It's just that the younger leaves are more sensitive. The flowers and the fruit, early on in the fruit, is also very susceptible, but you can see this is a figure from a paper I was just looking at on the right. And so on the the vertical axis is the relative susceptibility of the fruit tissue. And on the right is the days after bloom. So it's like, you can see 15 days after bloom, highly susceptible. But as you get into like 3 to 4 weeks after bloom, as those berries start sizing up and they start becoming sugar sinks rather than sources of sugar photosynthesizing, then the susceptibility drops off. And so essentially, if you can get the grapes through that period, from a fruit point of view, you're good to go. However, if you had infections that you didn't see, then the existing damage can show up as cracking. This is kind of what I call the sad mildew face on the grapes. I'm sure you've all seen that. And so those grapes are maturing normally, but they're damaged by mildew, so they're cracking. And they're still not going to be wine quality. So as we go towards veraison, then the fruit becomes immune to new damage. But if it's already been damaged, it's going to start showing up. And, it becomes immune to new infections. But if it's damaged, it's going to start showing up. The leaves, the stems, they're still going to be susceptible. But as that tissue starts to mature, it becomes a little bit less susceptible. So the fungus can continue to cycle on the leaves after veraison. Severe disease can actually cause the vines to have trouble photosynthesizing and delivering sugar to your grapes. So it's not over yet. You do have to manage the canopy. And then late in the season, that's when the sexual spores start to form. The significance of that is, first of all, so at the beginning, the fungus is like little colonies. It has to meet an opposite mating type, almost like sex in any other organism, but it's different with fungi, but it has to meet an opposite mating type, and it's not going to do that until the colonies have built up and started spreading around and meeting one another. So then, and as it exhausts more of the leaves and like the plant starts to kind of go down a bit, it starts to make these chasmothecia, these fruiting bodies that are going to survive into the next year. And then as the canes suberize, you can see the scars start showing up. Now, these scars, I don't think, I couldn't find definitive answer, but I'm pretty sure they're not infective themselves, except where they have these chasmothecia on them. But if they're near buds, then those buds are probably going to harbor the pathogen into the following year. So when you're out there pruning, if you see that scarring, that shows that mildew was there. And you need to think about, as much of it you can remove with pruning, great, but those survival spores, these chasmothecia, are going to be around. They're going to be on the bark. They're going to be in the litter. So if you see the scarring, you've had mildew. And so, we go into winter. As we go into dormancy after harvest, the chasmothecia, and that's basically, so once the leaves drop, once there's no more green stuff, mildew just goes into rest, and it survives in that way.
Where does it survive on? Just
on the bark?
On the bark itself.
Largely on the bark, and then sometimes on the leaf litter. But because the bark is actually still up on the vine, that's where most of the next year's infection is going to start, is from those little, so these fruiting bodies that are just, and also they're going to be on also maybe the canes, so even just the spurs you leave behind may have them. And really, that's where it's. Now, I think the next thing I'm going to go into control measures. So this is the biology of the organism. What does it mean? I mean, I think we've talked a little bit about it, but what is the significance for managing it there? Increased airflow and light penetration. I did forget to mention, actually, so this fungus grows right on the surface of the leaf. It doesn't really go into the leaves. And it's really exposed. And it's very sensitive. You can tell that the spores are clear. They don't have really pigmentation to protect them against ultraviolet light. So light actually destroys powdery mildew pretty well. So if you have an open canopy that gets a lot of light, air moves through it, humidity is reduced, you're already got half the fight done. Your control, you still have to spray, but your sprays are probably going to work. If you have alternatively a very dense canopy, light doesn't get into it, probably very humid in there, it's perfect environment for mildew. So having a more open canopy is a first step. Scouting and just having folks who are out in the vineyard or when you are walking the rows, just to be on the lookout for that kind of, not just the powdery mildew appearance, but even just chlorosis like that. Just like these little yellow spots starting to form. And sometimes you can turn the leaf over and see some mildew, but mildew often forms on the top of the leaf. And so those could be just early colonies that haven't formed spores yet. So if you can catch it early on, better. So now, UC IPM and I think it was Gubler's lab, right, that developed the risk index anyway. So over time, or maybe they just kind of developed it, but they developed basically a risk assessment index or just a risk index. So it's RAI or RI. You can find this on UC IPM. I've actually linked it in here. So when we share this slide, you can just click into it. And basically, it uses the biology of the fungus and its relation to weather conditions to give you a prediction of how severe the risk is. And I'll just show you a few excerpts of it. So it starts out, it says, infection occurs when the wetness period is followed by 10 to 13 hours of leaf wetness when temperatures remain between 50 and 80. So what they're suggesting is that when the conditions are right, you start looking for mildew. And then as soon as you see it, you start using the risk assessment index to determine how fast it's going to develop from there. I'm going to be really curious to hear from Hannah and Arthur about, do you actually look for it, or are you treating it prophylactically? Because the other thing that's really important is fungicides are, for the most part, protectants. They don't kill the infections that are already there. They don't get rid of them. They just keep new tissue from getting new infections. So staying ahead of mildew is really key. We'll talk about, you can eradicate it with using oils. I don't know how often that's in practice, but if you have a bad infestation, that's an approach you can take. I'm getting ahead of myself. So anyway, it just says, if lesions are found, then monitor disease by using powdery mildew risk index. And after you find powdery mildew infections, an epidemic, that is like uncontrolled increase, will begin when there are 3 consecutive days with 6 or more continuous hours between 70 and 85. Do you see where it's coming? It's like a model. It's like it's saying when there's this many hours, temperatures are like this. So to actually use the index, you kind of got to do some calculating, maybe make a spreadsheet. But there is actually an online model where it automatically does that. I was looking at it, and there's none for Livermore. Maybe I can work on that. So maybe that's something I can kind of work on, is to see if we can get the model extended and online, so you don't have to actually do calculations. You could just go on the website and see what it is. In fact, it's not, at least as of yesterday, it wasn't active anywhere except some part of the Central Valley, which might be a little bit further south of us. Anyway, so then there's a table that says if the index is 0 to 30, then here are the intervals. If you're using biologicals, or if you're using sulfur, or if you're using these kinds of fungicides, it gives you the interval you can be looking at. So as the pressure goes up, the interval gets shorter. So I'll see, what Arthur and Hannah have to say how much they use this or not, but it is a tool that's there. Often when we develop these tools, it's easy for scientists to do it. It's harder to implement them. You really do need to put some work towards it, and you're busy. Everybody's always, there's a million other things, not just mildew. So, but it's important to know that, this biology has been translated into a tool that you can use to at least have a sense of how bad of a year it may be based on the climate conditions. So a few notes on fungicides. I'm really going to leave that to Hannah and Arthur, but they're just the basic. Sulfur has long been used to control mildew. Positive about it is that the way it works, it's not likely for there to be any resistance built up to it by the fungus. And it's very effective. Some of the downsides are it can kill beneficial insects and really make mite problems bad. And it can be a problem in the winery if it's applied too late, and a lot of that sulfur ends up in the fruit after harvest, can cause fermentation issues. I remember there was concerns in the past about phytotoxicity, that is burning the plants, and I didn't see too much about it. I think it's just probably using a judicious amount is probably one of the key elements of not having that happen. Mineral oils are another classic control for powdery mildews. And the real reason to mention mineral oil is that it actually can kill existing infections. So often, the downside of it is it doesn't last very long. And nobody wants to be out there every 5 days spraying anything. But if you have a really bad outbreak somewhere, like a hot spot or something like that, I actually saw an Oregon State protocol where it said, first of all, you wash the leaves with water, like rinse them, because even though high humidity helps the spores grow, actual free water makes them pop or just doesn't let them go. So they're really evolved to grow without getting wet. They're for the dry season. So actually washing the leaves can wash off a lot of the spores, and then follow that with an oil treatment to kill the infections, and then follow that with a fungicide application was this particular protocol. I know that, again, I'd be curious when Hannah and Arthur are talking about it to know oils are used often in tank mixes anyway to enhance the effect of a fungicide. So there are a lot of synthetic fungicide choices, and I think we'll hear about them shortly. Advantages that many of them have a long residual effect, so it extends the period between sprays. They attack very specific biochemical pathways in the fungus, and for that reason, they are really liable to resistance. Now you saw how many spores that produces, right? And every one of those spores could harbor a mutation that's resistant to a fungicide. And if you keep spraying the same fungicide and that one particular strain doesn't get affected, it's going to produce more and more spores, and before you know it, that fungicide's not doing anything out there. So the key, as I'm sure we'll hear about, is to have a program that rotates fungicides, that uses combinations of modes of action, so that you're not acting on a single pathway in the fungus that a single mutation can build resistance to. They kind of just keep it on its toes, and it's like, okay, you're resistant to this one, not that one though. And so you don't get resistance building up. And again, it's because this fungus has such a tremendous reproductive potential that it is also really good at developing resistance. And another way to put that is it has very, very many cycles in a season. Some diseases you just get like 1 or 2 cycles. Powdery mildew, just like from the time things are good, every 5 to 20 days it might be putting out a new generation. You can, so it gets many generations in a season. So a quick summary of what we just went through. Most wine grapes, essentially all Vitis vinifera, are highly susceptible to powdery mildew until we have either genetically engineered our favorite vines or have somehow accepted to do some kind of alternative to them that are more resistant. We're going to be treating for mildew. Mildew is probably the thing that is going to be your problem every year, no matter what. Some years, based on weather, it might be worse or easier, but every season is a powdery mildew season. New infections start when the new growth is infected by a dormant fungus either in the bud or from the overwintering spores. Mild temperatures and humidity drive the infection cycle. Again, if you're comfortable, so is mildew. The critical period of control is before and during the first weeks of fruit set. And finally, rotating fungicide modes of action is essential for safeguarding the tools we have to manage it. There's a great UC book called Grape Pest Management. I hope many of you already have that. You can look into it and revisit the chapter on mildew. If you don't have it, you can order it. It's not that expensive, thankfully. And then there's UCIPM. And when you go to the UCIPM webpage, there's 3 different sections. One is for like home gardens. Make sure you choose the section on agriculture. And the risk assessment index is there too. That's it for me. I thought to put a picture of some nice healthy grapes just to brighten our spirits a little bit. And then I do have my program. Actually, our website just got updated and it's a complete mess. My apologies. But I do have a YouTube page and I'm on Instagram. If you want to follow me there. I call it Diablo Region Crops because I feel like Mount Diablo sits at the center of all the areas that I cover. And I think we have some commonalities in the region around this little mountain. And yeah, actually, I think I saw Julio come in. Yeah. Hi, Julio. So we made some nice videos. There's more in the pipeline on the YouTube channel. Yeah, thanks for your attention. I don't know if there's any questions, maybe just a few before we move on to the next section.
You raise a lot of issues. I mean, I'm concerned about this issue about under the canopy humidity. I mean, what are you telling us? Is it better to have a canopy where you let air through it, or should you have a overhanging canopy, or what is?
Right. So that's a very good question. The question being, not every canopy is open, and vertical shoot positioning is expensive. Is that the only way? Well, there are many factors. So I've focused on mildew today, but all of our decisions are informed by, many, many factors, and there's no perfect system. However, I think it's important to just know the principles. Yes, if you have a canopy that is dense and hanging, and there's more humidity in there, it is more liable to mildew issues. If you have a good air blast sprayer that can get good coverage in there, that can help you. If you can rethink things or just manage the vigor to be balanced, that can reduce those problems to some extent. That's why we have mildew as a problem, is that the best way not to have mildew is not to grow grapes. So it's a balancing act, absolutely. Yeah. Should you leaf or not leaf? That's another good one. Leafing will reduce the pressure for mildew, but it will potentially introduce problems with sunburn. It's expensive, depending on how you're doing it too. So, and it should be done well, right? Usually, again, it's been a while since I've spent quality time in vineyards, but like, yeah, you could, make sure you're pulling leaves on the right side and like not on the southern, western side, something like that. But yeah, so those are just things to think about, absolutely. Leaf pulling does improve mildew pressure. Please, yes.
There's a lot of vineyards that are abandoned or they're not pruned. Affect that as far as pressure on vineyards.
That's an excellent question. So lots of abandoned vineyards that are not being managed. Yeah, those are going to be absolute paradise for mildew because it's able to build up year after year. If they're not getting pruned, then they're probably very dense. The only advantage might be if they're not getting irrigated, maybe. Yeah, the canopy is probably weaker than it could be. But and if you're next to one of those things, then it's an uphill battle. I mean, in a way, the best thing to do is to get in touch with the owner and say, hey, you're causing a problem for me. Let's see if we can work something out. Because if you have that level of pressure, again, you could just picture those millions of spores. Even the best program might not hold up.
Yeah, so how far out would you estimate? I mean, I've seen this in the grape business, in our grape garden. So how far out would you?
I don't have a number for you. It's a good question. How far out, are you safe? Obviously, the further you get, the better off you are, but it depends on air movement patterns and conditions. Under the very good mildew, favorable conditions for mildew, it might get very far. Again, keep in mind, going back to the biology, you've got these colorless spores. As soon as they get blown out into the air, they're going to get sunlight hitting them, and they have very little resistance to UV radiations. They're just going to die. Most of them are going to get killed. So it's really that closer up that's an issue. Now, the overwintering spores that are the sexual spores, I think might have a little bit more resistance. So early in the season, it may be more critical. Anything else? You feel like you learned something maybe?
Oh, yeah.
Good. And that's what I'm aiming for. I never know. I always wonder if I'm going to wander into a room and everybody already knows everything. So. Thank you.
Hi, so we'll have a little break and then we'll get organized for the panel in about 5 minutes.